The wind of the high country carried a voice few could resist. It was a voice older than maps, older than trails, older even than the names given by explorers. It was the call of the mountains, rugged, towering, snow-tipped guardians of the wilderness. In the early 1800s, long before railroads carved steel paths through valleys, and long before towns pressed against rocky slopes, there were men who answered that call. They were called mountain men, trappers, wanderers, men of solitude, and sometimes men of desperation. Their lives were woven tightly into the land, a tapestry of endurance and will, of hunger and fire, of storms and shelter. The mountains promised riches, though not the kind glittering in coin. They held the fur of beaver, the pelts of wolf, the skins of elk and deer, commodities that would be sold in faraway cities for hats, coats, and cloaks. But the true wealth of these men was survival. Each sunrise, each night they lived to see another dawn, was a kind of fortune, won not with luck but with skill, instinct, and relentless willpower. Imagine it now, a single figure trudging across a white plain, snow crunching beneath his worn leather moccasins. His breath forms clouds in the freezing air. His rifle, heavy but dependable, rests against his shoulder. Every step carries him further from the safety of civilization and deeper into a world of silence. Behind him lies nothing but a fading trail. Ahead of him, mountains loom, jagged and cold, their peaks lost in swirling gray clouds. They are not welcoming, not gentle. They are fierce, wild, and untamed. And still he climbs. These men had little more than what they could carry: a pack on their back, a knife at their side, flint and steel to spark a fire, sometimes a small hatchet or an axe to split wood, a blanket, often made of buffalo hide, slung across their shoulders. That was all. Their wealth was not stored in trunks or banks, it was in knowledge. How to find water under snow, how to read the tracks of elk across a frozen valley, how to feel the air and know a storm was near. Without this knowledge, a man would not last a week. The mountains did not forgive ignorance. The cold was a teacher with no patience. The blizzard was a judge with no mercy. And yet, still, they came. They came from farms in the East, from crowded towns in Europe, from lives that offered little but labor and hunger. The West whispered of freedom. It promised space enough for a man to carve his own life with his own hands. But that freedom carried a price, and the price was survival in the face of nature's fiercest moods. The first days in the mountains were often a test. Before a man could trap or trade, before he could gather wealth or even settle for the season, he had to learn where to sleep, how to eat, how to stay alive when the sun fell and the air grew cruel. Shelter was not optional. Without it, the night could steal his breath before morning ever came. A mountain man would often search for natural formations, caves, rock overhangs, or hollowed-out trees to give him cover. But nature was not always generous. When the sky darkened and the snow fell, when the wind howled like wolves across the ridges, the man had to build his own refuge from whatever lay at hand. He gathered branches, logs, snow itself, anything that could stand between him and death. He learned to cut evergreen boughs for insulation, to pile snow into protective walls, to use bark as roofing. In time, his shelter became an extension of himself, a second skin against the storm. Those who survived their first winter carried scars, not always visible on their skin, but etched deep into their memory. They learned to fear the stillness of the woods, for it meant the storm was near. They learned the weight of hunger, the taste of thawed ice for water, the ache of hands stiffened by frost. And yet, they also learned the deep silence of the mountains at dawn, when the world seemed made only for them, untouched and eternal. The call of the mountains was not just about fur or fortune. It was about becoming something else, something wilder, something stronger, something that could outlast the storm. The mountains asked one question: "Can you endure me?" And the mountain men answered, not with words, but with the swing of an axe into frozen wood, with the strike of steel on flint, with the stubborn rising each morning to face another day in the wilderness. It was only the beginning. The storms had not yet arrived, the blizzards not yet unleashed their fury. The real test was still ahead. But even now, as the first snowflakes drifted down, catching on a man's fur cap and melting on his worn leather, he knew to survive here he would have to build not only shelters of wood and stone, but also a shelter within himself, a shelter of focus, grit, and endless patience against the cruelest teacher of all the mountain winter. The mountains were deceptive in their beauty. One day they glistened beneath a clear sky, their peaks shining like blades of silver. The next, they vanished into a shroud of white, where wind and snow erased every path, every footprint, every sign of life. A mountain man could never trust the commit was only the breath before the storm. And so, before the blizzards came howling, before the valleys filled with snow heavy enough to bury cabins to their rooftops, the men of the high country prepared. Preparation was not a luxury. It was the only line between life and death. Each day, from the moment frost first silvered the grass, the mountain man began to gather. He gathered wood, more than seemed possible, because he knew from experience that no amount ever felt like enough once the storms arrived. He stacked it carefully, high piles against the side of his shelter, splitting logs into halves and quarters until his hands blistered. A fire was not just for warmth, it was for life itself. Without a roaring blaze, the cold would seep through bone and marrow, and a man would freeze in his sleep before he ever stirred awake. Next came food. Hunting grew harder as snow thickened, so he worked tirelessly to lay traps, to fish streams not yet frozen solid, to bring down game and cure the meat with smoke. Deer, elk, or, if fortune smiled, a buffalo could provide weeks of meals. But more often than not, the men survived on smaller catches, hares, squirrels, or birds snared with patience and luck. Each strip of meat was precious. Nothing was wasted. Fat was rendered for tallow, bones cracked open for marrow, hides cured for clothing and bedding. The shelter itself had to be made ready. A crude lean-to could serve in the fall, but by the time true winter arrived, sturdier walls were required. Some men cut logs and built cabins, rough-hewn and low to the ground, their roofs slanted to shed snow. Others, when timber was scarce, dug into the side of a hill and created dugouts, their walls of earth lined with wood or stone. In the coldest regions, even snow itself became a tool piled into thick walls. It insulated better than wood. It was heavy, unyielding, but it held warmth like a blanket if built carefully. Inside these shelters, the mountain men worked to carve out small pockets of comfort. A bed of evergreen boughs laid beneath firs, a clay or stone hearth to hold the fire, cracks stuffed with moss, grass, or mud to keep the wind out. The air always smelled of smoke and pine, tinged with the scent of drying hides. It was not the comfort of cities or farms, but in the wild country it was home. Yet even as he prepared, a man could not ignore the weight of isolation. For months, snowstorms would cut him off from any human face. Silence pressed down heavy, broken only by the crack of a branch or the distant howl of wolves. It was in these hours that men sometimes spoke aloud to themselves, or carved small figures from wood, or sang songs from childhood to remind themselves they were still human. Survival was not only about warmth and food, it was about keeping the mind from freezing into despair. And the storms did come. They always came, first as a whisper of wind, curling around the edges of the shelter, sliding under the door. Then the whisper became a roar. Snow flew sideways, stinging like knives against exposed skin. The forest vanished in a white haze, trees bending, branches snapping under the weight. Men who had not prepared well enough watched their fires sputter, their food dwindle, their shelters collapse under drifts. Those who had prepared, who had stacked wood and sealed every crack, listened to the blizzard rage while their fires glowed warm within. But preparation did not end when the storm arrived. Even in the worst weather, a man might need to brave the cold, digging out a collapsed roof, checking traps, or simply shoveling snow away so his shelter would not be buried. To step outside in a blizzard was to gamble with death. The wind could strip a man's breath from his lungs, blind him in seconds, twist his sense of direction until he wandered in circles a few feet from his own cabin door. Many never returned. And so mountain men tied ropes from their doors to nearby trees, or carved markers into the snow, simple lifelines to lead them back to safety at night. When the fire crackled low and the wind screamed outside like a chorus of lost souls, the mountain man lay wrapped in hides, staring into the flames. His shelter creaked, the logs groaning under the weight of snow, and each sound made him tense. Would the roof hold? Would the fire last? Would the storm ever end? In the darkness, time stretched. Minutes felt like hours, hours like days. He had no calendar, no clock, only the endless sound of the storm. Still, he endured. That was the nature of the mountain man, to endure the hunger, the cold, the loneliness, to prepare for the worst and then live through it, day by day, fire by fire, breath by breath. And when the storm finally broke, when the sky cleared and the mountains glistened once more beneath a pale winter sun, he would step outside, blinking at the brilliance, and smile. For he had survived again, and yet deep within, he knew the truth. The mountains had not finished with him. The worst blizzards were still to come, and he would have to build stronger, dig deeper, endure longer. The fight with winter had only just begun. The storm had no mercy. Once it descended upon the mountains, it swallowed the world whole. The sky vanished beneath a ceiling of gray. The wind screamed down the slopes, and the snow came not gently, not in soft flakes that drifted lazily, but in torrents, driving sideways, pounding the earth with white fury. A man who dared step outside could not see farther than the reach of his hand. It was as though the world had dissolved into blindness, leaving only the roar of wind and the sting of ice against skin inside his shelter. The mountain man sat by the fire, listening. He could hear the storm's power as clearly as if it were alive, trees groaning under weight, branches snapping like bones, the roof of his cabin creaking as though giants pressed down upon it. Every sound was a reminder of how fragile his refuge truly was. For all his preparation, all his effort, the storm could still tear it away in an instant, and yet he had no choice but to trust it. He fed the fire carefully, placing one log at a time, knowing each piece of wood was precious. He could not waste fuel, but neither could he let the fire die. Without its glow, the cold would invade, creeping through cracks and stones, pressing into his chest until breath itself grew shallow. Fire was not warm. Fit was heartbeat, spirit, life itself. The air grew smoky, thick, and pungent. In small shelters with poor ventilation, smoke often hung low, stinging eyes, clinging to fur bedding, choking the lungs. Yet smoke was better than death. Many mountain men preferred the burn in their throats over the silence of a fire gone cold. Some even learned to sleep, half sitting their backs against the logs, so they could wake at the faintest sputter of flame. The storm would not wait for them. It would kill them in their sleep if they were careless. The greatest danger, however, was not only cold. It was collapse. Snow piled against the cabin walls, pressed against the roof, weighed heavier with each passing hour. The mountain man often rose from his place by the fire, wrapped in hides, and shoveled madly, carving tunnels away from the door, scraping the weight from the roof before it crushed inward. Each step outside risked death, but staying put meant suffocation or burial alive. More than one man had been entombed within his own shelter, fire still burning, food still near, yet no way to dig out as the snow sealed every exit. When the blizzard howled without end, hunger became another enemy. Traps lay buried beneath feet of snow, streams frozen solid. Whatever food he had prepared was all he could count on, and often it was never enough. He cut strips of dried meat into thin slivers, chewing slowly, letting the taste linger as long as he could. Some men boiled bones again and again, drawing every ounce of fat until nothing remained but brittle shards. The smell of cooking broth, thin though it was, lifted spirits, a reminder that even in the grip of winter, life still fought back. But there was a cruelty to hunger that no preparation could soften. The body weakened quickly, fingers grew clumsy, legs shaky, thoughts clouded. Some mountain men spoke later of strange visions during storms, shapes in the firelight, voices calling from the howling wind. Hunger and isolation blurred reality. One might swear he saw a loved one sitting by the fire, or heard the laughter of friends long dead. These hallucinations were not uncommon. In the silence of the mountains, when storms raged for days without pause, the line between memory and madness often broke. Wolves knew this too. Hunger drove them down from higher slopes, closer to the smell of smoke and human life. At night, their howls pierced the storm, rising and falling like ghostly choirs. Sometimes their yellow eyes glowed just beyond the firelight. They did not fear the snow the way men did, they thrived in it. A lone mountain man was no match for a starving pack, so he kept his weapons close, always within reach. His musket, though often unreliable in damp weather, might be the only barrier between his body and their teeth. Yet, through all of this, the snow, the cold, the hunger, the fear, the mountain man endured. His endurance was not born of arrogance, but necessity. Each hour survived was another victory. He marked no days, had no calendar. His time was measured by storms. A short storm, 3 or 4 days, was mercy. A long one, stretching into weeks, tested every ounce of his strength. And still, he whispered to himself in the smoke-filled dark, "Hold on. Just one more night, one more fire, one more breath." When at last the storm broke, and they always did, though sometimes it felt they never would, the silence was deafening. The wind ceased its screaming, the snow ceased its pounding. The air grew still, muffled, as though the world itself had gone to sleep. The mountain man stepped outside, blinking against the brilliance of sunlight on snow. It was blinding, dazzling, endless. The forest that had been dark and alive before was now frozen, silent, entombed in glittering white. He sank into snow up to his thighs with each step, shoveling a path, checking his traps, digging out what he could. His beard hung heavy with ice, his breath plumed like smoke. Yet he smiled not because it was easy, not because he had won, but because he had endured. Another storm would come, perhaps worse, perhaps soon. But for now, he stood beneath the pale blue sky, alive, and that was enough. To live in the mountains was to accept one truth: strength alone would not save you. It was cunning, small, clever tricks born from desperation that kept a man breathing when storms battered his shelter and hunger gnawed at his belly. The mountain man was not just a brute against the elements. He was an inventor, a builder, a student of nature. And when blizzards struck, it was these hard-won lessons that often made the difference between life and death. The first trick lay in clothing. In the early days, when many newcomers tried to conquer the Rockies with wool coats from the cities, they froze. Wool soaked with snow grew heavy and stiff, pulling warmth from the body instead of protecting it. But the mountain man learned quickly by observing the native tribes. Layers of fur and hide were superior buckskin for strength, buffalo robes for weight, rabbit fur for lining. Some even wore the skins with the fur turned inward, trapping body heat more effectively than any European garment. Moccasins, stuffed with dried grass or moss, kept feet warm and insulated. The lesson was simple. In the mountains, nature provided better than the towns ever could, but clothing was only the beginning. A man who understood fire understood survival. Fires in the high country could not simply be piles of logs tossed into flame. The snow and damp air made wood reluctant to burn. Mountain men learned to carry dry tinder in pouches close to their chest, where their body heat kept it dry. Birch bark, fatwood, and dried moss became treasures more precious than gold. Some men even built double fires, one outside the shelter to keep the snow from piling against the door, and one inside to hold warmth. Others dug fire pits beneath the snow itself, crafting little caves that captured the heat more efficiently than open flames exposed to wind. Yet, fire alone could not always hold back the cold. In desperate times, men turned to the snow itself as an ally. Though it seemed an enemy, snow was also an insulator. Trapped air within packed drifts kept warmth inside better than bare timber walls. So when cabins threatened to collapse, or when a man was caught outside with no shelter, he dug. He carved a hollow into the drift, just large enough to curl inside, lining the floor with branches and hides. Within minutes, the howling wind above was muted, and though cramped, the snow cave held a pocket of survivable warmth. Claustrophobic, yes, but to choose between panic and frostbite was no choice at all. Food required its own tricks. When traps froze under drifts, when the streams iced over so thick a blade could not pierce it, the mountain man relied on hidden caches. Before winter's grip tightened, he sometimes buried meat deep beneath the snow, marking the spot with carved sticks or strange patterns only he could read. Other times, he carried pemmican, the mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries, learned from native tribes. Dense, long-lasting, and nourishing, pemmican could keep a man alive when all else failed. He ate it sparingly, gnawing at small pieces to trick his stomach into feeling fuller than it was. The nights were the most dangerous. Coldest hours came before dawn, when the fire had burned low and fatigue pressed heavy. Some mountain men tied bells or rattles to their doors, so even in half-sleep they would be woken by wolves testing the edges of their camp. Others kept their rifles within arm's reach, wrapped in cloth to keep the powder dry. And then there were those who made companions of their hardships. Dogs, often half-wild creatures themselves, were not just hunting partners, but living blankets. A dog curled against a man's side could mean the difference between waking up, alive, or never waking at all. But perhaps the greatest survival trick was not physical at all. It was the strength of the mind. The mountain men knew that despair was as deadly as hunger. In the endless silence of storms, men who gave up, who stopped fighting, who let hopelessness settle like frost into their souls, those men did not last. To endure, one needed stubbornness, even defiance. A man might sing to himself, recite old poems, carve notches into wood to mark the days, or speak aloud as if surrounded by friends. These rituals kept the spark of humanity alive. For once that spark dimmed, the mountains claimed another body, lost beneath the snow. Blizzards could last for weeks. Men might emerge gaunt, beards iced into ropes, ribs visible beneath furs. They walked with slow steps, their muscles stiff, their breath wheezing, and yet they endured, living proof that survival was not about thriving, it was about outlasting. The mountain men did not conquer the cold. No man could. They endured it, tricked it, hid from it, and when the sun returned, they crawled from their shelters, scarred but unbeaten. For every storm survived, there was another lesson etched into memory. How to layer hides. How to find dry tinder in a world of snow. How to carve a cave from the very blizzard that sought to bury you. Each trick passed from one man to the next, whispered over fires, traded like gold. And slowly, a culture of survival took root, not of heroes or legends, but of men who refused to die when death pressed on all sides. The mountains respected only one kind of man, the one who would not yield. And so, armed with cunning, with patience, with stubbornness that defied the storms, the mountain men continued to build, to endure, to survive. Each winter was a battle, each spring a victory. For every story of survival, there were others, darker stories, whispered in low voices around lonely campfires. The mountains did not spare everyone. They claimed their due, year after year, storm after storm, and in their silence lay countless unmarked graves, hidden beneath snowdrifts, scattered across forgotten valleys. These were the tragedies of the high country, reminders that the line between endurance and death was thinner than a breath. One tale often told among the trappers was of a man named Elias Carr, known for his strength and boldness. He had built a fine cabin deep in the pines, with walls thick and a roof strong. He thought himself secure when the storms came, but pride is a fragile shield. Elias had prepared wood, yes, but not enough food. By the second week of the blizzard, his traps were buried and his larder empty. They found him months later, slumped near the hearth, fire gone cold, his bones sharp beneath his skin. He had written nothing, left no words, only the silence of hunger's victory. His cabin remained, for years afterward, a lonely monument, its logs blackened by time, its hearth forever empty. Another tale, more chilling still, was that of two partnersmen who had trapped together for seasons, bound by friendship and need. Caught in a storm that lasted 21 days, their food dwindled to scraps. Hunger grew sharp, and so did their tempers. At first, they argued over firewood, then over who would take the last piece of meat. By the time spring thaw revealed their shelter, one lay buried behind the cabin, hastily covered in snow, while the other sat inside, eyes hollow, whispering to himself. No one ever asked what truly happened, no one dared. But among mountain men, the story was told as a warning. Hunger can make enemies of brothers. There were the nameless, too, men who vanished in storms, never seen again. Sometimes only a musket was found, leaning against a tree, or a torn scrap of clothing snagged in branches. Wolves grew bold in those winters, circling the camps of the living, their howls echoing across the night. Mountain men knew what it meant when the wolves' bellies were full in the dead of winter. It meant another man had fallen, another life ended in silence and snow. And then there were those who froze, not from carelessness, but from exhaustion. Men who trudged too far from their shelter during a lull in the storm, only to be caught in the sudden fury of white. They wandered, blinded, their steps heavy, until the cold claimed them. Their bodies were often found curled against stumps or rocks, as though they had tried to sleep, their faces strangely peaceful. To fall asleep in the snow was to surrender to the final trick of the cold, deadly comfort that lured men into eternal rest. Perhaps the most haunting tragedies were the ones witnessed. Survivors told of partners lost just yards away, swallowed by snow, of fires that sparked shelters into flames, leaving men to choose between burning and freezing, of men who dug frantically at collapsed roofs, only to find companions suffocated beneath. These stories were not legends, they were scars, etched into the memories of those who lived through them. And yet, for all these tragedies, the mountains remained indifferent. Storms returned each winter, howling with the same fury, as if mocking the losses of the year before. There was no justice in the high country, no fairness. A careful man might die, while a careless one stumbled into survival. The only constant was the cold, vast and merciless. Mountain men carried these stories with them, not to frighten, but to remind. Every log chopped, every strip of meat cured, Every crack sealed with moss was done with the ghosts of the past whispering behind them. The dead were their teachers, their warnings. Elias Carr's empty larder. The brothers turned against each other, the nameless bones gnawed by wolves. The man who slept in the snow and never woke. Each was a lesson carved in blood and frost. And still the living pressed on. They had no choice. The mountains were their world, their prison, their refuge, their test. And though death walked beside them, though every storm carried the weight of tragedy, the mountain men endured. They did not conquer the blizzards. No man could, but they learned to bend, to adapt, to take each loss as a lesson. For, in the end, survival in the wild was not about defeating the storm. It was about refusing to give up, even as it buried the world around you. When the storms finally broke and the mountains loosened their icy grip, a strange silence would fall across the land. Snow melted into rushing streams, the frozen rivers cracked open, and the buried valleys breathed again. The wilderness, which only weeks earlier had seemed like a white tomb, now pulsed with life. For the mountain men who had endured, it was a season of reckoning, of mending broken shelters, of burying the dead, of gathering what strength remained for the battles yet to come. Spring was not mercy, it was opportunity. The blizzards left scars on the land and on the men, but survival meant learning how to build again. The first task was always firewood. No one who had lived through a starving, freezing winter ever underestimated the worth of a log. Trees felled in spring were split and stacked, drying in the sun, each piece a promise against the winter to come. Some men built wood piles as tall as cabins, walls of fuel standing like fortresses around their homes, for they knew what it meant to run out when the snow lay deep. Cabins battered by storms were repaired, gaps chinked with fresh mud and moss, roofs weighed down with stones to resist the next winter's winds. Men who had barely survived swore never to be caught unprepared again. They rebuilt stronger, dug deeper cellars, set snares early, and planted small gardens if soil allowed. Some learned to store food high in trees or in hidden pits, for blizzards could strip supplies or wolves could sniff them out. Every act of preparation was carried out with the ghosts of the dead whispering in the background, "Be ready or be gone." Yet the thaw brought more than rebuilding, it brought reflection. Survivors carried heavy memories of what they had seen. The death of a partner, the hunger that hollowed their stomachs, the nights when the fire dwindled. These were not wounds that healed with sunshine. They became a part of the men themselves. Faces grew leaner, eyes sharper. Laughter came less often, but when it did, it rang louder, as though mocking the storms that had tried to silence it. Some men left the high country after such winters. They went down into the valleys, back to trading posts, or even farther, where winters were kinder. They carried their stories with them, warning others of the cruelty of the mountains. Yet others returned year after year, as though the storms themselves had claimed them not as victims, but as part of the wilderness. These were the men who accepted that suffering was not an accident, but the price of freedom. The mountain men who stayed carried rituals of resilience. After the thaw, they would walk the land, tracing the paths where they had hunted, the ridges where storms had howled, the meadows where snow had swallowed them whole. They would mark places of loss with simple gestures, a carved name on a tree, a pile of stones for a grave. And then, with the respect of those who knew the fragility of life, they moved forward. The wilderness gave nothing freely, and so they took what they could and left behind the rest. With spring also came abundance. Rivers swelled with fish, animals returned to the valleys, and the forests sang again with life. The men hunted, trapped, and feasted, their hunger finally quieted. The lean and hollow faces of winter grew fuller, and strength returned to tired limbs. But even in the bounty there was a wariness. They knew the mountains had simply paused, not relented. The storms would come again, and so each piece of meat smoked, each pelt stretched, each cache buried was done with a grim knowledge. This will save me when the blizzards return. The resilience of mountain men was not born of courage alone. It was carved out of fear, sharpened by loss, and hardened by the relentless cycle of nature. To live in the high country was to die and be reborn each year with the thaw. They buried their dead in frozen ground, but they did not bury their will. Instead, they built higher stacks of wood, thicker walls, and stronger hearts. The mountains tested them endlessly. But in surviving, the mountain men became something more than ordinary men. They became creatures of endurance, shadows among the pines, ghosts of the wilderness, who understood that suffering was not to be avoided, shouldered, and turned into strength. When the valleys bloomed with flowers and rivers ran wild with the rush of melted snow, the mountain men stood taller. They had faced death, and though they bore its scars, they were still there, still breathing, still preparing, still waiting, for they knew the truth the mountains had carved into them. Winter always returns. Survival in the mountains was never a matter of brute strength alone. The men who lasted, the ones who came out of blizzards alive, carried with them not only courage, but a kind of wild ingenuity, creativity sharpened by desperation and honed by necessity. To live through a winter storm was to think like the land itself, to read the snow, the wind, the trees, and to bend them all into allies. The first and greatest skill was shelter. A man without a roof was already half buried in his grave. When the blizzards howled down from the peaks, even the strongest cabin could feel like a sieve against the cold. The mountain men learned to make the land itself into a shield. Some dug into the sides of hills, hollowing out burrows like bears. Others carved snow caves, shaping tunnels into drifts so thick they became fortresses, insulated by the very substance that threatened to kill them. It was strange but true. A well-built snow cave could hold warmth better than a hastily thrown-together hut. Inside, the breath of a single man could keep the air from freezing solid, while outside the wind screamed like wolves. But not every storm gave time for digging. Sometimes a blizzard rose without warning, swallowing the sky before a man had even thought of camp. Then speed and instinct ruled. Branches cut in haste, lashed together with rawhide or rope, covered with pine boughs or even the skins of animals, became Leanta's fragile shelters that could mean the difference between frostbite and another sunrise. Mountain men carried axes like extensions of their arms, and in moments of panic, those blades were worth more than gold. A tree felled in the right place could form both wall and firewood. Its branches bent to block the wind, its trunk split for heat. Fire was no luxury, was survival. But in the howling cold, fire was a fickle friend. Snow dampened, wood hissed and spat. kindling froze as stiff as stone. A man who struck flint in the dark, fingers numb and clumsy, knew that failure meant death. So the survivors prepared. They carried tinder tucked close to their bodies' dry moss, shavings of birch bark, even gunpowder wrapped in cloth, anything that could catch a spark and hold it. Some mountain men spoke of fire as if it were a living thing, a spirit that demanded respect. They coaxed it, fed it, protected it. Once it caught, it became the heartbeat of the camp. The difference between stories whispered into the night and silence forever. Traps and tools were another measure of survival. Deep in winter, game grew scarce, but hunger never did. The men built deadfalls for rabbits, snares from rawhide, and pit traps for larger prey. Snowshoes, woven from sinew and bent wood, kept their boots from sinking into endless drifts, each step a victory against exhaustion. Without them, even a short journey could drain a man's strength to nothing. Hunting in deep snow was brutal work. Every shot wasted meant another day hungrier, but those who survived learned to stalk with patience, to track by the faintest sign a tuft of fur caught on a branch, the shadow of a print half buried by snow. Water, too, became a trick of survival. To drink snow was to starve the body of heat, for it melted by stealing warmth from within. The clever melted it by fire, or carved channels into ice, gathering what trickled out. Some men carried tin pots tied to their belts, always ready to catch life from frozen streams. Others learned to watch for icicles forming on cliffs or pine branches, breaking them off and warming them in their hands until they dripped. And still, shelter and fire, traps and tools, none of it was enough without the knowledge of the land. The men who died were often those who underestimated the mountains, who thought themselves masters when they were only guests. But the survivors studied the wilderness. They read the signs of storms in the sudden silence of birds, the way the wind shifted before snow, the crack of ice on a far ridge. They built with what was around them, made do with what they carried, and improvised with what chance gave them. Some men carried stories of the ingenious things they had seen. A man who lined his moccasins with hot stones wrapped in cloth to keep his feet from freezing on the march. Another who stitched together scraps of fur to make mittens when his own had burned by accident. One who built a windbreak from the frozen body of an elk, crouching in its shadow until the storm passed. These were not the actions of men chasing glory. They were acts of desperation, of will, of the raw refusal to die. For in the end, ingenuity in the mountains was not about invention for its own sake. It was about survival, about finding ways to outlast the cold one night longer, to hold out against hunger one day more. Every shelter thrown up, every spark coaxed into flame, every trap set in the deep snow was a declaration: I will not surrender, not yet. And so the mountain men endured, not because they were stronger, not because they were braver, but because they were endlessly resourceful. They lived on wit as much as on meat, on knowledge as much as on fire. Each winter tested them, stripped them down, demanded new tricks, new solutions, new courage. And each time they survived, they carried those lessons forward, sharper, harder, more prepared than before. The storms could howl, the snow could bury the valleys, the cold could bite through to the bone, but so long as a man had shelter, fire, tools, and the will to use them, he had a chance. and in the white wilderness, a chance was everything. Survival in the mountains was never a matter of brute strength alone. The men who lasted, the ones who came out of blizzards alive, carried with them not only courage, but a kind of wild ingenuity, creativity sharpened by desperation and honed by necessity. To live through a winter storm was to think like the land itself, to read the snow, the wind, the trees, and to bend them all into allies. The first and greatest skill was shelter. A man without a roof was already half buried in his grave. When the blizzards howled down from the peaks, even the strongest cabin could feel like a sieve against the cold. The mountain men learned to make the land itself into a shield. Some dug into the sides of hills, hollowing out burrows like bears. Others carved snow caves, shaping tunnels into drifts so thick they became fortresses, insulated by the very substance that threatened to kill them. It was strange but true. A well-built snow cave could hold warmth better than a hastily thrown-together hut. Inside, the breath of a single man could keep the air from freezing solid, while outside the wind screamed like wolves. But not every storm gave time for digging. Sometimes a blizzard rose without warning, swallowing the sky before a man had even thought of camp. Then speed and instinct ruled. Branches cut in haste, lashed together with rawhide or rope, covered with pine boughs or even the skins of animals, became Leanta's fragile shelters that could mean the difference between frostbite and another sunrise. Mountain men carried axes like extensions of their arms, and in moments of panic, those blades were worth more than gold. A tree felled in the right place could form both wall and firewood. Its branches bent to block the wind, its trunk split for heat. Fire was no luxury, was survival. But in the howling cold, fire was a fickle friend. Snow dampened, wood hissed and spat. Kindling froze as stiff as stone. A man who struck flint in the dark, fingers numb and clumsy, knew that failure meant death. So the survivors prepared. They carried tinder tucked close to their bodies' dry moss, shavings of birch bark, even gunpowder wrapped in cloth, anything that could catch a spark and hold it. Some mountain men spoke of fire as if it were a living thing, a spirit that demanded respect. They coaxed it, fed it, protected it. Once it caught, it became the heartbeat of the camp. The difference between stories whispered into the night and silence forever. Traps and tools were another measure of survival. Deep in winter, game grew scarce, but hunger never did. The men built deadfalls for rabbits, snares from rawhide, and pit traps for larger prey. Snowshoes, woven from sinew and bent wood, kept their boots from sinking into endless drifts, each step a victory against exhaustion. Without them, even a short journey could drain a man's strength to nothing. Hunting in deep snow was brutal work. Every shot wasted meant another day hungrier, but those who survived learned to stalk with patience, to track by the faintest sign a tuft of fur caught on a branch, the shadow of a print half buried by snow. Water, too, became a trick of survival. To drink snow was to starve the body of heat, for it melted by stealing warmth from within. The clever melted it by fire, or carved channels into ice, gathering what trickled out. Some men carried tin pots tied to their belts, always ready to catch life from frozen streams. Others learned to watch for icicles forming on cliffs or pine branches. breaking them off and warming them in their hands until they dripped. And still, shelter and fire, traps and tools, none of it was enough without the knowledge of the land. The men who died were often those who underestimated the mountains, who thought themselves masters when they were only guests. But the survivors studied the wilderness. They read the signs of storms in the sudden silence of birds, the way the wind shifted before snow, the crack of ice on a far ridge. They built with what was around them, made do with what they carried, and improvised with what chance gave them. Some men carried stories of the ingenious things they had seen. A man who lined his moccasins with hot stones wrapped in cloth to keep his feet from freezing on the march. Another who stitched together scraps of fur to make mittens when his own had burned by accident. One who built a windbreak from the frozen body of an elk, crouching in its shadow until the storm passed. These were not the actions of men chasing glory. They were acts of desperation, of will, of the raw refusal to die. For in the end, ingenuity in the mountains was not about invention for its own sake. It was about survival, about finding ways to outlast the cold one night longer, to hold out against hunger one day more. Every shelter thrown up, every spark coaxed into flame, every trap set in the deep snow was a declaration: I will not surrender, not yet. And so the mountain men endured, not because they were stronger, not because they were braver, but because they were endlessly resourceful. They lived on wit as much as on meat, on knowledge as much as on fire. Each winter tested them, stripped them down, demanded new tricks, new solutions, new courage. And each time they survived, they carried those lessons forward, sharper, harder, more prepared than before. The storms could howl, the snow could bury the valleys, the cold could bite through to the bone, but so long as a man had shelter, fire, tools, and the will to use them, he had a chance. And in the white wilderness, a chance was everything. The howling winds and bitter cold of the mountains were enemies enough but for the men who faced them. There was another foe, quieter and more dangerous. It crept into their bones, not with frost, but with silence, loneliness, fear, the crushing weight of isolation that came when the snow fell too deep, when the trails vanished, when the world turned white and empty, and the only heartbeat was your own. A man could fight the cold with fire, the hunger with traps, the snow with a shelter. But what did he use to fight the voice in his own head when the nights dragged on without end? Many mountain men discovered that winter was not just a test of body, but a trial of the spirit. Alone in a storm, time twisted, hours stretched into days, days into weeks. Some men marked the passing of time by scratching lines into logs or bones. Others lost track completely, swallowed by the monotony of survival wake. Stoke the fire, check the traps, chew on tough meat, lie down, and start again. Without company, a man could begin to doubt his own senses. He might hear whispers in the wind, footsteps outside his shelter, or voices calling from the snow. The mountains had a way of turning silence into ghosts. Yet loneliness was not always forced. Some men sought it, believing that solitude would sharpen them, make them harder, closer to the wilderness. And perhaps it did. But even the strongest often admitted, in rare moments of honesty, that loneliness was the hardest enemy of all. The cold could bite, but it was predictable. The silence was merciless. That was why companionship, when it could be found, was so precious. Two men sharing a fire was more than just warmth. It was safety, laughter, the sound of another voice cutting through the emptiness. Stories told in the flicker of firelight became medicine for the soul. Tales of home, of sweethearts left behind, of hunts and narrow escapes, of other winters survived. Even arguments could feel like blessings, because they reminded a man that he wasn't utterly alone in a land that wanted him dead. And then there were the bonds that went deeper than friendship. Mountain men learned quickly that survival often depended on trust. In a blizzard, you needed someone who would not leave you behind, who would share the last scrap of dried venison, who would break the trail through chest-high drifts when you could no longer lift your legs. These bonds were forged not in comfort, but in shared misery, and they became unbreakable. Some called it brotherhood, others simply called it survival, but it was real, and many a man owed his life not to his own strength, but to the hand of another who refused to let him fall. Fear was another constant companion. It came at night, when the fire sputtered low and the wind clawed at the walls of the shelter. It came in the sudden crack of a branch under snow, in the distant howl of wolves, in the thought of what would happen if the fire died or the roof collapsed. Fear was sharp, and it could cut a man down, but it could also sharpen him. Fear kept him alert, kept him checking the fire, double knotting the lashings on his shelter, listening for signs of danger. Too much fear broke men, but the right amount could keep them alive. Some mountain men turned to ritual to hold their minds together. They prayed, whispering words into the storm, begging for another sunrise. Some carved charms or war tokens from loved ones, believing these objects carried protection. Others sang to themselves, low and steady, filling the silence with music when the world grew too quiet. Each man found his own way of holding back the tide of despair. But the mountains were not only cruel. They also gave moments of strange beauty that reminded men why they endured. The silence after a storm, when the snow lay smooth and untouched, glittering in the pale light of the moon. The sudden call of a raven breaking the stillness, reminding them that life persisted even here. The glow of firelight against a cave wall, painting shadows that looked like stories come to life. In those moments, even the loneliest men felt part of something vast, something ancient, something both terrible and beautiful. The emotional toll of survival could not be measured in scars or frostbite. It lived in the eyes of the men who returned from the mountain's eyes that had stared too long into blizzards, that had seen death close enough to taste it, that had fought with silence and sometimes lost. Some came back harder, their hearts sealed in ice. Others came back with an unshakable respect for life, for fire, for the warmth of a voice in the dark. And perhaps that was the greatest mystery of all, how the mountains could break some men and yet forge others into legends. The snow buried their trails, the storms erased their names, but the truth of what they endured lived on in the stories told around fires, in the whispers of history, in the knowledge that survival was never just about tools or shelters. It was about the spirit, about the will to go on, about refusing to surrender to loneliness, to fear, to despair. For, in the end, the blizzard was not only outside, it was inside. And the men who survived were not only those who mastered the mountains, but those who mastered themselves. If you wish to know how truly harsh the mountains could be, you need not rely only on imagination. The words of the mountain men themselves, scratched in journals, carved into memories, and retold as campfire legends, carry the truth of winters that nearly broke them. These stories, often half-remembered, sometimes embellished, always ring with the weight of lived experience. They show us not just how men built shelters and fires, but how they clung to hope when the blizzard threatened to tear it away. One such voice comes from Osborne Russell, a trapper who spent years wandering the Rocky Mountains in the early 1800s. In his journal, he described the sudden violence of winter storms days. The snow fell so thick, out the sun and the earth was nothing but white. He told of men who wandered from camp in such storms and were never seen again, swallowed by the snow as if by an ocean. His words remind us that the blizzard was not simply weather, it was a predator, hunting without mercy. Then there is the tale of Hugh Glass, a man more legend than flesh. Though most remember him for the bear attack that nearly killed him, few recall the winters he survived, alone and half-dead, trudging through ice and wind with nothing but scraps. Some say he dug himself into snowbanks to escape the storms, lying as still as a hibernating beast until the fury passed. Others whisper that he chewed on leather straps when food was gone, waiting for the sun to return. Whether fact or myth, his endurance burned into the memory of the frontier in the diaries of lesser-known trappers. Fragments of desperation appear. One wrote of waking in the night to find his fire buried beneath a drift, his shelter collapsing inward. He clawed his way out like a man escaping his own grave, fingers bloodied, breath ragged, lungs burning with the cold. Another recorded the death of a companion who lay down in the snow, too tired to go on, whispering that he only wanted to rest. By dawn, he was frozen stiff, a silent figure beneath the pale sky. The survivor wrote simply, "I walked on." Legends, too, grew in the telling stories passed around fires, where men sought comfort in shared dread. One such tale spoke of a group of trappers caught high in the mountains when a storm closed every path. For days they huddled together, their fire failing, their food gone. They stripped the leather from their packs and boiled it into broth, chewing the softened scraps with teeth that ached from the cold. They said the storm broke only when one of them began to sing. His voice cracked and weak, yet carried through the night like a beacon. Whether true or not, the story became a testament. Not all survival was muscle and strength. Sometimes it was song, spirit, and sheer defiance. Others told of men who built shelters so ingenious that they became myths. A snow cave shaped like a spiral, designed to block the wind no matter its direction. A hut made from frozen buffalo hides, lashed so tight that it stood against the gales. A man who supposedly survived by hollowing out the belly of a horse, sleeping inside its carcass through the night, emerging at dawn, alive though reeking of death. Gruesome as it sounds, such stories carried the echo of truth, for survival often demanded what civilized men would never dare. The journals also remind us of the silence after the storm. One trapper wrote of stepping outside after 3 days of darkness, only to find the world glittering under a sun so bright it blinded him. The snow lay smooth, unbroken, stretching to the horizon like a sea. He felt himself small, insignificant, yet alive, and, in that moment, he said, The mountains seemed both cruel and holy. Another wrote of the loneliness of hearing no sound but his own breath, no sign of life but his own shadow, until at last a raven's cry split the silence. That simple sound, he said, felt like salvation. And then there are the names lost to history, men who never left their shelters, whose journals never reached another hand, whose bones were buried beneath drifts that melted in the spring. We know them only through the warnings of survivors. Don't wander when the storm blinds you. Don't trust the silence. Don't ever believe the cold will spare you. Their lessons were written not in ink, but in the absence of their return. What binds all these accounts, true or exaggerated, is the shared understanding of what it meant to face the blizzard. It was more than a test of endurance. It was an encounter with a force greater than any mana force that could strip him of pride, of hope, of reason, until only the bare will to live remained. In those white-out nights, men met themselves in their most honest form, stripped of luxury, stripped of society, stripped even of certainty. They were left with a single question: do you want to live? The diaries, the legends, the whispers, they all answer the same way: yes, with fire coaxed from frozen tinder, with shelters dug in snowbanks, with songs sung into the dark, with prayers, with tears, with silence endured. For every name remembered in books, 100 more vanished. But their stories linger in fragments, carried forward by the men who survived. And in those fragments we hear the heartbeat of the mountains, ruthless, merciless, yet unforgettable. The story of the mountain men does not end with their shelters of snow, their fires coaxed from frozen tinder, or their footsteps carved into drifts that melted with spring. Their true legacy lives in something far larger, something that stretched beyond their lifetimes. It lives in the memory of endurance, in the stubborn will of humanity to outlast even the fiercest storms. For every man who died alone in a blizzard, his name erased by the wind, there were others who carried forward the lessons he left behind. They learned which valleys offered shelter, which trees burned hottest, which mistakes could never be made twice. They passed down this knowledge, sometimes in words, often in scars. To survive a winter in the mountains was to become both student and teacher. For the storm was a school no man could graduate from, only endure, only carry its wisdom into the next season. In the end, the mountains themselves became the keepers of their stories. Each frozen ridge, each shadowed valley, each drift of snow held the echoes of laughter, the cries of suffering, the crackle of campfires that had once beaten back the dark. And though spring melted the evidence, the memory lingered, woven into the land as surely as the rivers and pines. What is remarkable is not only that these men survived the blizzards, it is that they returned to them again and again. Most could have fled to gentler lands, to towns with roofs and stoves, to fields that gave food without bloodshed. But something in the wilderness called them back. The storm was their enemy, yes, but also their teacher, their crucible, their proving ground. They lived in its shadow because they believed that within its fury they would find their truest selves. There is a strange poetry in it, that men sought out the very places that tried to kill them, and in doing so they wrote a story that still stirs our imagination centuries later. Their lives remind us that survival is not comforted, is hunger gnawing at the belly, cold burning the skin, silence pressing against the mind. It is making fire with trembling hands, sleeping in a shelter carved from snow, singing into the night to keep despair at bay. It is enduring, one breath at a time, one heartbeat, one stubborn refusal to quit. And what of those who did not return? Their memory is no less powerful. They are the shadows behind the stories, the caution in every whispered warning. Their absence is a reminder that nature does not forgive, that survival was never guaranteed. The blizzards claimed them, but even in death, they became part of the Lord, the unnamed companions, whose sacrifice makes every tale of endurance more precious. Taught today, when we walk the mountains, we see trails, cabins, ski slopes, and cozy lodges. The wilderness feels tamed, accessible, even safe, but the echoes remain. In every gust of icy wind, in every stretch of untouched snow, in every sudden storm that blinds the peaks, there is a whisper of the old struggle, a reminder that not long ago, survival here was not recreation, it was everything. The mountain men are gone now. Their names are fading into the frost of history. Yet their spirit endures in the way we admire resilience, in the way we crave adventure, in the way we tell stories of those who dared to live on the edge of survival. They remind us that comfort is not the only path, that there is meaning in hardship, beauty in struggle, and greatness in endurance. And so the tale of survival in blizzards is not just about the past, it is about all of us. For though we may not face storms of snow and ice, each of us walks through storms of our own loss, fear, loneliness, despair. And the lessons of the mountain men are still true. Build your shelter, guard your fire, trust your companions, face the storm with courage, refuse to surrender. The blizzards may howl, the nights may seem endless, but as long as we carry the will to endure us, long as we choose life, one breath at a time, we, too, will see the dawn.